Hello everyone, and I welcome you all to the first session of the course History of English Literature. It's our first session, so we will start by taking a look at the early beginning of English literary history. Today's discussion is going to be mostly on how England actually was before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons and when the history of English literature began. So, in order to understand the history of the English language and literature, we first have to understand the socio-political history and the early inhabitants of Britain. For that, let's look at the chronological order of the tribes that came and settled in England. Among them, the first were the Celts, who were also known as Britons, and it's said that the name Britain originated from this tribe. It's believed that the Celts inhabited England up to 43 AD. Then the Roman invasion happened in 43 AD and the era continued till about 410 AD. Following that, Britain experienced a period of social and political unrest until the Anglo-Saxon period began in 450 AD and the era concluded with the Norman Conquest in 1066 AD. Here is an important point to remember. The Viking invasion, which is also a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon period, began in 793 AD with the raid on Lindisfarne, and this era also ended with the Norman Conquest in 1066 AD. The Old English or Anglo-Saxon period is frequently referred to as the Dark Ages because the majority of the literature was oral in nature and was either lost or damaged by several tribal invasions. That's a reason for some historians to believe that the starting point of English literary history is 1066 AD onwards with the Norman Conquest, but some historians also hold a different opinion that we need to trace back the history from the Anglo-Saxon times onwards because that's where the Old English literature is located. It's also necessary for us to know about the original Celtic inhabitants of Britain in order to get a sense of national heritage and how the English language evolved with time. So let's look at the original British nation and the history of English literature from the time of the Celtic migration to this island that is currently known as England. As we discussed earlier, the Old English or Anglo-Saxon period spanned from approximately 450 AD to 1066 AD, and despite coinciding with the Dark Ages of England, it is known as the foundation period of English identity and language. That's why understanding England before and after the arrival of the Germanic tribes like Saxons, Angles, and Jutes is indispensable for an understanding of Anglo-Saxon literature. But before jumping into the Anglo-Saxon period, we will discuss the original inhabitants of England and the influence of Romans on their socio-political history. So, we will start our discussion with the Celtic tribe or the Celts who arrived at the shores of Britain and lived there during the Iron Age, the Roman Age, and the post-Roman era. The Celtic society was led by druids or priests who preserved the myths and legends by reciting long heroic poems as the Celts didn't have a form of writing at this time. They spoke the common Brittonic language, which is far different from Germanic languages, and practiced ancient Celtic religion. This proves that the original inhabitants of England were the Celts, and that's another reason for historians to consider that the starting point of the history of English begins even before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons and even the Romans. Here we should remember that English is actually considered a West Germanic language which shares characteristics with other Germanic languages including grammar and vocabulary. While English has a Germanic foundation, it also has significant vocabulary borrowed from Latin and French, particularly for more formal or complex words. Today, English is a global language with diverse dialects and accents, but its core structure and vocabulary remain rooted in its Germanic heritage. Alright, so it was in the year 43 AD that the Romans invaded Britain and successfully conquered most of England under the leadership of King Claudius. At first, the Romans used the name Britannia and later they changed it to the Roman province of Britain, which became a part of the political union that covered most of Europe. The city Londinium, which is currently known as London, was established by the Romans, and it was also the capital of Roman Britain. Surprisingly, the Celts and the Romans coexisted peacefully throughout the period, and that's why the Romans were able to build a system of government in Celtic England without resorting to bloodshed or force. In fact, their military camps were quite different than the military camps we know today, as these camps led to the emergence of towns, mostly Romanized towns in England, and they also ensured that a good infrastructure was in place. So, in that sense, the military presence helped a lot in maintaining peace during Celtic times. Despite the clear political opposition, the Celtic tribes adopted and practiced Roman civilization, and Romans too were devoted to England because England had extremely rich and arable land that had rich metal reservoirs. Furthermore, England's geographical location made invasions and attacks challenging for the invaders, which on the other side made things easier for the Romans to maintain their empire. So, what were the implications of the Roman regime? Other than proper infrastructure, the Romans also introduced the Latin language and Christianity. They also left behind many written and archaeological sources, including Hadrian's Wall, roads, coins, gravestones, statues, baths, forts, and palaces. You all may be thinking, what is Hadrian's Wall? Just like the Great Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall is also a former defensive fortification of the Roman province of Britannia. The construction began in 122 AD during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, and that's why it's known as Hadrian's Wall. So, when everything was going so smoothly, then why did the Romans withdraw from Britain? To know the reason behind their withdrawal, we first have to discuss the division and fall of the Roman Empire. As we all know, the Roman Empire was one of the largest empires in the ancient world that included Spain, France, Germany, Britain, and parts of North Africa and Western Asia as well. So, over time, it also became extremely difficult to protect, defend, and rule this empire due to its enormous size. And that's why in the year 285 AD, the Roman Emperor Diocletian split the vast Roman Empire into two manageable regions. Among them, the first was the Eastern Roman Empire, which included regions such as Egypt, Cyprus, Turkey, Israel, etc. And second was the Western Roman Empire, which included France, Britain, Germany, Italy, etc. Then, in around 407 AD, the Western Roman Empire began to fall apart due to the constant invasions by several invading tribes like Vandals, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and Huns. So, in order to safeguard and mitigate the attacks, Roman soldiers started to retreat from Britain and move towards the attacked regions to protect them. Thus, by 410 AD, every last Roman soldier had withdrawn from Britain, and that's how the roughly 367 years of Roman regime came to an end. After the departure of the Romans, around 410 AD, Britain became open to attack and totally defenseless, as they did not have any kind of army to protect themselves. That's when we find many sets of tribes from different areas invading Britain, and among them, the two most important tribes were the Picts and Scots, who arrived in England from the north and from Ireland. At this juncture, England experienced severe invasions by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, who raided the coasts of Britain while seeking wealth and land. These raids gradually took the shape of larger migrations and settlements, as these groups finally established themselves in Britain and eventually formed the Anglo-Saxon kingdom in 450 AD. The Celts first welcomed them, since the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes provided protection against the Picts and Scots. However, this decision proved to be a grave mistake when they chose to enlist the aid of one group of invading tribes in order to defend themselves against another group of invading tribes. Though these Germanic tribes, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, protected England from the impending attacks of the Picts and Scots, they also ended up driving out the original inhabitants or the local Celtic population into the infertile mountain regions and Wales. So, was there any kind of resistance offered when the Anglo-Saxons began their attack? The answer is yes. Several accounts, particularly in the Historia Brittonum, which is a 9th century text, describe a leader named Arthur who led the Britons in battles against the Saxons. The Historia Brittonum mentions a battle at Mount Badon, where Arthur is credited with leading the Britons to victory. Despite all this, the historical validity of King Arthur is a hotly argued topic, and it is also debatable whether King Arthur really existed or was merely a fictional character. Since King Arthur is not mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is arguably the most significant historical record of the Anglo-Saxon era, or later in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, many historians even contend that he may be a Celtic deity who was worshipped during that time but was subsequently forgotten. For these reasons, historians are unsure whether King Arthur ever existed or not. So, what did the Anglo-Saxons do after they settled down? They established 5 kingdoms, and they were Kent, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. During that period, 4 major dialects also developed, and among them the earliest was Northumbrian, which also produced the first oral literature of any type. And the other 3 dialects were West Saxon, Kentish, and Mercian. Among these 4 dialects, West Saxon gained greater dominance over the others due to Wessex political supremacy, and also because this was the language of King Alfred, about whom we will discuss in a later session. For the time being, just keep in mind that King Alfred was the monarch of Wessex who united all the kingdoms against the Vikings and was mostly in charge of bringing education back to England following the Viking invasions. Now let's discuss the Vikings and their characteristics. So, Vikings were basically a group of very ruthless and violent invaders who primarily came from Scandinavia, specifically from Denmark and Norway. They were quite dreaded during that time and were mostly associated with war and conquest. Their violence was notorious, and during the Anglo-Saxon period itself, the Vikings invaded Britain several times and fought 2 major battles. Once in 793, which is known as the Raid on Lindisfarne, and again in 878, which is known as the Battle of Edington. The Viking army landed in the East Anglia region during their second conquest and began to advance on Wessex, where they encountered King Alfred, who achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Edington, leading to a treaty with the Vikings. This treaty established the Danelaw, which is a region in northern and eastern England where Viking laws and customs prevailed, while the rest of England stayed under the rule of King Alfred. However, despite effectively establishing a code of conduct for almost over half of England, the Danes were unable to maintain their hold over the region because they lacked any deserving successor, which ultimately led to the end of Danelaw's dominance by 1066 AD. So now we can conclude that the Anglo-Saxon period, which is also known as the Old English period, began after the Romans, and the name Britain changed to Angleland, which later evolved into England. Now the question is, what exactly marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon period? On September 25, 1066 AD, King Harold Godwinson's army successfully defeated the Norwegian forces in the Battle of Stamford. Unfortunately, this triumph was quite fleeting, as within 3 weeks, the Normans launched another invasion. Soon, William, the Duke of Normandy, and his army arrived at Hastings. At that time, England had just come out of a battle and was not prepared for this onslaught, so they didn't have the time to gather the necessary supplies that are required for the battle, nor did they have a proper plan to counterattack against the Normans, but they still proceeded with the war. At the Battle of Hastings, Harold and his men fought very bravely, but then Harold made some serious mistakes as a general, which ultimately ended in a defeat. Although initially Harold's troops were in a stronger position, William was still able to trick them away by instructing his forces to pretend to flee. As usual, parts of Harold's forces raced after them and they were all slain. This strategy proved to be the turning point of the battle because the split in Harold's army enabled William to win the Battle of Hastings. Though Harold tried his best to rectify his mistake and fought to the end, it was already too late by then and he was eventually killed by an arrow in the eye. Coincidentally, Harold Godwinson also happened to be the last Anglo-Saxon king that we are aware of, and that's why the Anglo-Saxon era ended with the Norman Conquest and his death. This is a crucial event politically, geographically, and also linguistically because from then on, 1066 AD with the Norman Conquest, we began to see the rise of Norman French influence in England. The Norman French influence started to persist, and the Germanic influence that the Anglo-Saxons had previously introduced started to diminish. Then, consequently, French also took over as the official language, replacing the Old English that the Anglo-Saxons used. According to historians, this is the final event that marked the end of Anglo-Saxon dominance in all respects. In the next session, we will discuss the poetry and prose that began to emerge during the Old English period, which will also give a clearer understanding of what type of literature was famous during that time and how they describe the socio-political life of people during that period. So that's it for today's lecture. Thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Goodbye.